It is very special to have a chance to speak here, and as Meryl said, really special, and we feel very lucky to actually be on the same section of the coast. It was a delight, and a lot of the identity of our childhood was growing up around on the ocean. It's fun to actually have the identity of a lot of life now, be that as well, sort of wearing different hats now, but interacting with much the same space of the oceans. I have to say that the hat that I wear is a lot less silly looking than the hat that he has. So I want to share with you some science. I'm now a professor at UC Santa Barbara. I want to share with you some science that I do in my lab. But the first thing I just wanted to highlight was, in addition to doing research and teaching and doing the general job of running a lab and being a professor at UC Santa Barbara, I also have the privilege of running a center called the Benioff Ocean Initiative. And the center there is about trying to use science to try to do something useful for the oceans. It's the way at least I think of it often is it as a hospital for the oceans. The concept there is that if you, we really want to make marine science help out with marine problems. It's the sort of the ideas we sort of kick around and why we actually launched this initiative was because there's a lot of science and a lot of research that's done that's not necessarily applied to actually fixing ocean problems. And the hospital motif comes from the idea that if you had a cancer center, a cancer biologist sitting on a UC, and they weren't actually helping cancer patients, they wouldn't be doing a lot of good, or wouldn't be doing the maximum amount of good they could do for our communities. And it's the same model that we're sort of walked over into this Benioff Ocean Initiative. So the program itself runs derives its inspiration and a lot of its power from communities. We ask the community to send us ideas that you want marine scientists to work on, problems that you see in the oceans that you want marine scientists to fix. So start with just a plug for that, an invitation. If there's anything that you as ocean-caring, ocean-loving people have some ideas that you'd like to see more attention paid to marine science, jump on it, send us a note. And that's something that we are actively pushing and evolving. So I want to jump to some of the science that I want to share with you tonight. And the theme for the science that I'd like to share sort of connects to this icon, which is a symbol from a Norse myth. This is a serpent, a malevolent serpent called Jormungand. In this Norse myth, this serpent was basically running around on land, causing all kinds of problems to humanity. And all the people essentially got fed up of all the trouble that was being brought to life and villages from this serpent. And they said, okay, we're going to push this serpent into the ocean. Serpents aren't supposed to make it in the ocean, right? Your snakes aren't supposed to do well in the ocean. This particular one did very well in the oceans. In fact, it did so well in the sea that it grew to this immense size in this myth, grew and wrapped its body all around Earth, Middle Earth in the myth, and its head latched upon its tail. And in this myth, the idea of the effect of this serpent latching its head onto its tail created a kind of stability that held Middle Earth together, prevented it from falling apart. So sometimes when I think about our interaction with the oceans and how humans are influencing a future for ocean health, I think about this motif. We weren't pushed into the oceans, but we jumped in a big way into the oceans and have been thriving just as successfully, more successful even than this serpent has in the oceans. If you were to sit around a campfire some 500 million years ago, and if you were to ask somebody across the campfire, hey, you tell them, hey, we're gonna get into the oceans and we're gonna become one of the biggest ecological forces out there in this biggest ecosystem on the planet, we would just have been laughed at because we weren't made for operating in the oceans. There would be no expectation that us as sort of a land creature was gonna get in there and be so ecologically successful. But we have, and the reason that we have, and the reason we've come to such ecological dominance in the oceans is because we relied on the same thing that's allowed us to be successful in so many other domains of our life, ecological life, social life. And that is because we embrace technology incredibly successfully. So technology has helped us get into the oceans in a big and serious way. It's helped us fish in some of the deepest parts of the oceans, access some of the most remote parts of the oceans, act as predators, as fishers, as participants, way out and way beyond what we ever could have anticipated our presence being in the ocean. This is a plot that I think highlights this idea that humans are a dominant and ever-present force of influence on our oceans. This looks a lot like a global map. It's not actually a map. It's a plot of data. It is a collection of sensors that have been taken, that we amassed from billions of different data points from sensors that are placed on fishing boats all across our global oceans. We take all that data and we process it, we plot it, and the activity of fishing vessels is so high in all of our oceans that you see essentially all of the continents on the planet become outlined because there is such dense activity of fishing boats out there on the seas. So again, this idea that we are now a dominant ecological force in the oceans feels about right when you look at a picture or a plot like this. Now, this Jormungen thing, right, this idea of a head biting a tail is also sort of wrapped up here, and this is what I mean to sort of draw out as we get deeper into our chat here together, is that technology has got us out into the oceans, into these remote parts of the oceans, has got us to be a dominant actor in the ecosystem that is the oceans, but technology now is allowing us to actually see where all of that activity is taking place, and perhaps very thoughtfully can help us manage our influence as it grows in the sea. So that's the theme I'd like to keep touching back on as we dive into this science and explore some science together tonight. I do a lot of work on the biology of extinction, and that's what I'd like to talk a fair amount about tonight. A lot of you are aware that extinction is not a new thing on our planet. Extinction is a relatively old biological phenomenon. We've seen some very big extinction events in the deep history of life on our planet. There are commonly recognized 5 mass extinctions that take us back hundreds of millions of years. And these are pretty serious events in the history and the biology of our planet. Take this one here, the Primo-Triassic extinction. This is an extinction in which 95% of the species in our ocean went extinct. It's an event that's sometimes called the Great Dying, right? I can't think of a better name for what happened then than the Great Dying. 95% of the species in the oceans went extinct. There's another one of note here, not quite as bad as the Great Dying, the Cretaceous-Paleogene extinction. That was a boundary that is an extinction that my 4-year-old hates. Anyone guess why my 4-year-old hates that one? The dinosaurs, right. This is when a 10-kilometer asteroid hit our planet, and it hit our planet with such force. The energy that was generated from the impact of this asteroid was equivalent to about 1 million nuclear bombs going off. Think about that, 1 million nuclear bombs going off. That's what happened about 40 or 50 million years ago, a little bit more than that, during the KPG, the Cretaceous-Paleogene extinction, and it wiped out the dinosaurs, right? So not a fan in the McCauley family, at least the next generations of Macaulays. So those are the historical, that's sort of old business for extinction on our planet. There is a lot of talk in the scientific community, and perhaps you've sort of seen some of this being reported on in the media, that we're looking at a new 6 mass extinctions. We have those 5 historical mass extinctions. Maybe we're looking at the emergence of a 6th mass extinction. Now, this science and this conversation and what's inspiring scientists to begin to float that idea is not the notion that somewhere in NASA in DC, people are looking at a radar screen and see a new asteroid headed for our planet. It's rather that when you look at records and rates for extinction around us today, that we are seeing elevated rates of extinction that are on par with some of these big mass extinctions that we've seen in Earth's history. This is elevations in the rates for things like mammals and birds, amphibians and reptiles, way above background rates of extinction. And again, approximating some of these rates that were observed during these large mass extinction events during Earth's history. So a lot of this science about a possible 6th mass extinction is largely being driven by observation and study of animals on land, terrestrial species. The question that I'd like us to ask together here at Channel Islands National Park and have a unified appreciation for the oceans is there any evidence that this 6th mass extinction that seems to begin to be showing itself on land Is it leaking into our oceans? So that's the question I'd like all of us to engage. We'll look at that from a variety of perspectives, and maybe we'll think about whether there is evidence for this, how we might engage it constructively, and in effect, try to nip it in the bud. So evidence for a sixth mass extinction in the ocean. Let's start by trying to get our heads around whether that is a real thing that could be beginning in the seas by looking at patterns of extinction on land. We're going to go back in time. We're not going to go too far back at the start. We're going to go back about 50 or so thousand years. In this plot, I'm first showing you extinctions that are associated with us, with people. We are, at least as the scientists associated with this idea of a sixth mass extinction, we seem to be the new asteroid. So each of these bars shows us the number of extinctions that have occurred during this 50,000-year history in different parts of our planet. One thing that is interesting, or at least is interesting to me, is that there's sort of a pulsed nature to extinction. You see humans arrive to Australia, and you see this little blip on the extinction radar screen. You see humans arrive to the Americas. There's a big blip about 14 or so thousand years ago. You see humans in the last 500 years get to about every part of our planet, and you see this gigantic bar register in our extinction radar. This is the data in this section right here that really is driving this scientific conversation about whether a sixth mass extinction is beginning now on land. That's the story on land. We sort of had our head around that from a different view, the other graphs previously. What's going on in the ocean? So let's throw up in blue the number of extinctions that we've seen over the same time period in the oceans. So stepping back 50,000 years, we essentially have silence all the way across this record, all the way across this timeline until we just get to the last 500 years. So, relatively speaking, this question of what's going on with extinction in these oceans, this question of whether we're beginning a sixth mass extinction in the oceans starts with a bit of good news. Don't worry, if you don't like good news, we'll get to some bad news to sate everyone from different perspectives. But it starts with some good news. If you actually went through and tallied up in this last block, in this last 500 years, how many extinctions have people caused on land versus extinctions in the oceans? It's about 500 extinctions on land, and at the same time period, 500 years, about 15 extinctions in the oceans. So looking at pictures here of what I often call the Ocean's 15, the species that fall into that documented category for ocean animals that have been driven extinct by humans. So we can look at that same pattern from just a different angle again. So this is a cumulative number of extinctions on land. Extinctions really started to rocket. In the oceans, as I said, we have this really happy pattern. We have this lovely flat line for extinctions. It seems from this first vantage point that right now, 2017, we are not looking at a sixth mass extinction in the oceans. And I have to say, when I started this research, I had no idea exactly where and exactly what I would find. I was delighted to see a bit of good news. All too often in environmental research, you get bad news. But here we are. And here is exactly when we want to stay with extinctions in the sea. There are some interesting things we can do with this data to help us begin to answer that or engage that question about staying there, about keeping extinction low in the oceans. One thing we can do is look at where risk lies. Look at what species are in trouble in the ocean. So expert scientists sit down many times a year. And you have an expert scientist about sea turtles or seabirds or salmon or whatever it is. They sit down and they class the risk that every species, they try to get every species on the planet. We're not quite there yet, but we have a lot of species in this risk database. You can pull those out and you can get an idea of where risk lies for different kinds of taxonomic groups, different kinds of species. And that can give you some understanding of who's doing bad and who's doing good. And when you find out who's doing bad, maybe you can mount some proactive intervention to help make sure that that flat line of extinction in the oceans stays flat. Here's some examples of the kinds of things you can learn. Red is bad, right? On this side of the graph, in the light green, I'm showing you clumped together species that live in the ocean, but during some part of their life history, some part of their lives, they go to land. That could be to breed, that could be to nest, be just to thermoregulate, like a mammal, a seal, or something like that. Animals that end up contacting land during some point in their lives actually show a lot more red than those that are exclusively aquatic. And that makes sense, right? Again, if we hang on to this idea that we are the new asteroid, you get closer to the fire, you get burned, right? That seems to be what's happening with a lot of these species that end up on land at some point in their life. Here's another example. We can look at cartilaginous fish. Those are sharks and rays versus ray fin fish. That's pretty much everything else, bony fish in the ocean, the things that we would usually buy in the fish market. Cartilaginous fish, sharks and rays grow slower. They take longer to mature. They are much slower lived, as we say, and they have more red. They are more at risk, and that makes sense. If it takes longer to get to maturity, and if you kick out your offspring, you're going to be in a higher threat category. These are the kinds of things that you could learn by just looking at a mosaic of risk in a plot like this. Here is an example, just to bring this home to the Channel Islands. We're not talking about, this is a global plot, but we're talking about species in this global portfolio, some of which that we find right off here in the Channel Islands. So, for example, southern sea otters are coded in this, are coded in all of these bars we're looking at here. The black abalone, the blue whale, snowy plover. These are all things that are our local backyard version of this global conversation about who's at risk and how can we keep them from falling off an extinction cliff in the sea. A different vantage point, there are lots of ways to assay health in the oceans, right? Extinction is just one, right? You just say, is that species alive or is that species dead? Is every single last one of them dead? You can imagine there's a lot of ways in between. If you think of this as a measure of ocean health, there's a lot of other ways in between to measure how healthy things are doing in the oceans. One way is to measure the size of life in the oceans. You can measure how healthy is the size distribution of life. Just to give you an idea of how that looks, the size distribution has changed a lot here on land. This is a lot of what, if you were to go to a hike in Ventura 15,000 years ago, this is about the early mid-Pleistocene. Well, that'd be about mid-Pleistocene. If you were to go on a hike up in the hills of Ventura, you would see a very different kind of California. You would see a California where, for better or worse, on your trail, you'd really hope you had my big brother, who now the federal government, for some reason, is armed. You would hope he was there on the trail with you, because you'd be sharing company with saber-toothed tiger, with short-faced bear, with camels, with condor, with mammoths, right? This would be a very different kind of scene. There's a very different kind of distribution of size of life. If we fast forwarded here and went on a hike next weekend, right, we would see a handful of the same species that you can detect in this Pleistocene view are still hanging on. We still have raccoons, perhaps less scared in that tree, and coyotes that were alive back then and are alive today. But we've seen a dramatic shift in the size of life. We essentially lost the biggest of the mammals, at least, and often people call this the megafaunal extinction on land. So that's another way to assay life. So clearly something disruptive, clearly something unwanted ecologically happened on land in the last 15,000 years in terms of the distribution of life. This is a little bit more of a dull way to put this, but if you actually plot the distribution of life from the Pleistocene or mammal life here in California during the Pleistocene and mammal life during 2017, you see a divergence over here in the biggest part of life, which means that we've lost the mammoths here, we've lost the ground sloths, these things that were 8 feet tall, that towered above you with these gigantic claws. Those amazing big mammals, part of the portfolio of biodiversity here on land, gone. If you do the same exercise in the oceans and you map all of the mammals in the oceans, and you map the body size distribution for animals in the Pleistocene and the modern, these two lines go right on top of each other, which is to say that simply the biggest animals that ever lived in the oceans are still out there living in the oceans today. And that's kind of special. We haven't disrupted this distribution of life in the same way under the oceans in the sanctuary and beyond, in the national park and beyond, as we have right here on land in Ventura. So that's another viewpoint of our impact on marine animal life. Okay, let's push ourselves to go from today, 2017, and try to develop a view of what life could look like, what the situation could look like for marine animals going forward. Let's just imagine, all right, well, what kind of risk, what kind of future might we expect in the next 100 or several hundred years in our oceans? To go forward, I'd like to go back even further. We're going to go back more than 50,000 years. We're actually going to go all the way back on this side to about 70 million years. I'm showing you another view of extinction. This is percent genus extinction. If you go high, that's bad. That's a lot more extinctions. We're looking at mollusks, things like clams and oysters and all of our shelled bivalves. And you have vertebrates, right? So something bad was going on about 65 million years ago. This is the dinosaur extinction. So wiped out the dinosaurs. We can see the signal in the fossil record for the loss of mollusks and vertebrates way back in this period. Well, things kind of bounce around and aren't looking too terrible. And here we are again, 2017, where we're seeing pretty low rates of extinction. Now, what I'd like to do is take the plot that we looked at of all of the risk for what marine animals are facing today, all the risk of extinction they're facing today, and then build some scenarios, build some hypotheses to say, okay, what if we take all of the red listed animals? What if we take everything that people say is sort of teetering on the edge of extinction, and in a scenario, we push them over that extinction cliff and we imagine they go extinct? Where does that take us in the future? If everything that scientists are saying could go extinct, did go extinct, how bad would that look in the oceans? So we know that things are pretty good in the oceans. We know that if you look right now and stick your head underwater in the national park, you do not see a 6-mass extinction occurring. But what can we say about going forward a couple hundred years? If you do scenario building like that, and you push all the species that scientists say could go extinct or in a high risk category for going extinct, you unfortunately push your extinction rates, both for mollusks and chordates, all the way up into that space. That space, again, up here, is a high extinction rate space that is actually pretty darn near the high extinction rate space that we saw when this asteroid hit the planet, when we saw this energy release that was the equivalent of a million nuclear bombs, right? So, as I said, there's some good news here, which is to say that right now we're in pretty good shape in terms of extinction in the oceans, but let's not get too comfortable with that, because it seems that if we buy these risk ratings that scientists are assigning to marine life, it would be all too easy for us to create a 6-mass extinction in the ocean, something that is on par with some of these bad events, really bad events that we've seen in ocean history, in Earth's history. Okay, so here we are now. Good news, flat line of extinction. It seems that it would be easier than we wished to go to bad news, to go somewhere in the near future up to catching up, essentially, on these catching up in these extinction rates that would take us closer to what things are looking like on land and closer to the threshold of what would qualify as a 6-mass extinction. So we don't want that to happen, right? Probably clear consensus here. We don't want that to happen. I don't care if you're a fisherman or if you're a whale hugger or anywhere in between, right? You don't want to go from here up to there. So how do we prevent that from happening? What tools do we have? What science do we have? And what kinds of change should we be looking for that may push us in that direction? To answer how to prevent from going there to there in the oceans, one of the things that really has me intrigued is what happened here. So here on land, when things were a flat line of extinction and then suddenly they arced up, what changed in this space? What changed in this history of our relationship with ecosystems that caused extinction to really ramp up and rates really to start skyrocketing? Let's hit guns. That's right. So let's look at that. So this all took place about the time of the Industrial Revolution. So we're talking about a change in rate about the 1800s. So a lot of things happened. Technology, like guns. Let's look at a portrait of change both on land and sea across some of this space. We're starting back 50,000 years ago. Remember, we saw those extinction plots that we've been driving animals extinct from a long time, even before we had guns. We had spears, and spears and elbow grease and a little bit of hunger. Humans went a long way. We were able, with that combination, to drive things like mammoths and these ground sloths extinct on land. Then, absolutely, you guys are right. We developed new technologies to do that business, but to do it with industrial strength. With guns, we were able to drive some of the most prolific species on the planet on land extinct, like the passenger pigeon. Now, this is a species, right? Hard to imagine this, but a species, a bird that was so prolific, so abundant that the skies turned dark as a wave of these passenger pigeons went over top, right? That's how many birds there were. And we drove them completely extinct. Not one of them left. There's a couple of museums, stuffed passenger pigeons. Did the same thing, or nearly did the same thing to the American buffalo. And something else changed. So we started with simple tools. We advanced the technology for hunting species directly. And then something really fundamentally different happened after guns. That is, we switched from trying, at least in my opinion, from trying to hunt buffalo or hunt animals directly for food, for pelts, for bones to build our houses or whatever, a long time ago. We switched to trying to hunt their homes. That is, we switched to needing to build out our cities, our agriculture, our industry into the ecosystems of wildlife on land. And remember, we pointed to the Industrial Revolution as this turning point for extinction on land. That was also this turning point in our impact and the footprint of human influence on ecosystems. It was an acceleration point for the rates by which we changed, altered, modified ecosystems and animal homes on land. We can sort of intuitively understand that there's probably a relationship between switching over to hunting animal homes and changing extinction rates, right? If you're really good at hunting deer, you may be able to, if you have no regulation, drive that deer species extinct. If you're really good at hunting forests, well, there are hundreds of species in that forest. So if you get in the business of hunting forests, changing, modifying, using habitats, you could drive hundreds of species extinct. And that can really change the rate of extinction, right? So that's old history. We've done that. That is in our history books for ecology on land. We're asking this question of what's going on in the ocean to see if we can learn anything from the history on land that can help us prepare to prevent the same sort of history from being remade in the sea, the same history that showed that acceleration of extinction on land, prevent that from occurring in the oceans. So a key question is there anything in this deep history of human influence with the oceans that suggests maybe we're moving towards an industrialization or an industrial evolution of the oceans? It's kind of a funny question, right? You go out to the Channel Islands National Park, the last thing you think about is an industrial revolution in our oceans, an industrial revolution in our sea. Now, that's usually the last thing that I would think about too. But in this exercise, in this science, in this research, what we're trying to do is say, okay, we kind of get what things are like around us right now, but we want to do a slightly edgier exercise. We want to use all the data we have to say, well, what is changing? If it's changing so slowly, we're not even noticing this. And what will that change build towards in 100 or 200 years for our oceans? So let's look at some patterns, and you guys can evaluate them as to whether it's outlandish to think of an industrial revolution slowly, slowly, slowly beginning in the ocean. Let's look first at an industry that was never present in the oceans, mining. We're very good at mining on land. We do it everywhere for all kinds of things, but we never mined in the oceans. It used to be science fiction, the stuff of movies. Now it is science. It's the stuff of industry and stock market. So there are over 1 million square kilometers of ocean that are gazetted in seabed mining claims, and most of these claim areas have come online just in the past decade and a half. This is an industry that has some, if you're an engineer, some pretty fabulous machines or scary machines, whatever your perspective is. These are 300-ton waterproof robots that we're sending down to the deepest parts of the ocean to essentially churn up the seafloor and to extract rare earth elements and other precious and valuable things. So it's a complicated one, right? You can imagine what a marine biologist's perspective is about a machine like this hitting a deep water coral reef. Yet I also have rare earth elements in my iPhone, my laptop. So it's a complicated one. Energy. We're building power plants in our oceans, slowly but surely. This is the global growth for the number of wind turbines that we're putting offshore into the oceans. So you don't see a lot of this in our own backyard. You don't see a lot of this in the United States. You don't see a lot of this in California. We are beginning to plan out marine energy farms, marine wind farms offshore in central California, just up north of where I am in Santa Barbara. Most of this is happening in Asia and happening in Europe. If you fly into Amsterdam, you'll fly over a section of ocean that looks, looks like that. So this is something that is beginning the business of building power plants in the oceans in a big way. You can imagine this one's complicated or has pros and cons too, right? So anyone who knows anything about the oceans knows that the oceans are in trouble because of climate change. We're essentially causing the oceans to become warmer, to become more acidic, and to become less well oxygenated. There's less oxygen in the ocean. Slowly but surely, all three of those things are happening. And you don't need a professor of marine biology to tell you that an ocean that is hotter, that is more acidic, and has less oxygen in it is going to be a harder ocean for ocean life, right? Just imagine an aquarium at home. If you were to pull the plug on the bubbler and you were to pour just a tiny bit of acid in there, and you were to crank up the temperature valve or the temperature control on your aquarium, what would happen to your fish, right? Well, it is happening very, very slowly, all those things in the oceans. So tapping into low carbon energy is an important part of dealing with that problem for our oceans and for our planet, but it's also a lot of new human stuff. in the oceans, potentially in the way of migrating whales, or potentially in the way of all sorts of other marine life, right? This is happening, appears to be a thing in the oceans. Marine traffic. Traffic is increasing, we know, on our highways on land. Guess what? It's increasing in the oceans as well. Here's a plot of a global increase in traffic. We see this familiar exponential growth for traffic in the last several decades. This, by the way, is the recession, so you can see that registering when we stopped buying things. But traffic, as it increases in the oceans, brings a lot of the same problems for ocean life that it brings for life on land. We have increased noise in the oceans as a result of increased traffic. We have a new movement of invasive species. We have pollution, we have oil spills. We even have collisions in the oceans. The first project that we're working on, the initiative that I told you, is about trying to slow and stop collisions between whales and ships. This is a big problem right out here in the national park, right offshore from where we are. It's mainly blue whales that we're concerned about out here, an animal that we can't afford to see more loss of. It's unfortunately colliding, or the other way around, I suppose, with these container ships. One last indicator of change, one last indicator of this potential shift from us hunting and going after animals for dinner, and potentially beginning slowly, but potentially surely, towards a future where we're using the homes and the space of oceans in different and unique ways. This is farming. We're becoming ocean farmers. We were always ocean hunters. We've been ocean hunters for a long time. Some of the oldest fish hooks we've found in the archaeological record are 50,000 years old. The Chumash that lived here and out in the Channel Islands were fishing at the time they arrived, and were excellent and high technology fishers. So, but we are seeing a fundamental shift occurring now in the oceans. And this shift is essentially on par for me with the shift that occurred on land, at least in terms of impact, from when we stopped becoming hunters and then became farmers. So there was that period in human history where we no longer could just run out into the forest and get dinner for our family and get dinner for us, our community as hunters. We had to start farming things. It seems that that shift is now occurring in the oceans. 2014 was the first year ever in which all the people on the planet together, if you sum up all the fish they ate, 2014 was the first year that we ate more fish that came from farms than came from the wild. So that transformation point, we've already crossed it. We're going in a different direction. We're becoming intense farmers in the oceans. There's good and there's bad in this too, right? There are all kinds of problems that come from fish farming, but in some situations it may be able to take some heat off overfished wild fish stocks. So it's another complicated one. So here we are. If we look at a handful of indicators, here we are potentially looking down the barrel at a future in the oceans in which it doesn't seem so ludicrous that perhaps something in the history of our relationship with land may be repeating itself in the way that we use ocean ecosystems, ocean space. And if indeed that shift is occurring, if there's a shift occurring from us hunting animals directly to hunting their homes, if there's the beginning slowly of an industrial revolution beginning in the oceans, then there is the possibility that that could, in the next 100 years, change where this very happy, very flat line is right now. So we agreed, I agreed with you, I agreed for you that we didn't want that to happen. If there is any potential that that could happen, what tools do we have at our disposal to try to help make sure that doesn't happen? Let's look at some tools. One that is actively used here in the national park with great success, used up and down the California coast and beyond, are parks, right? You see guys like Merrill wearing funny hats across parks on land. You go to those places, and guess what you see? You see wildlife. You see elk and deer and bear in higher abundance than you see anywhere else on the planet, or at least anywhere else in California or America. That's where you go to see wildlife. Same deal underwater. Parks underwater have these higher densities of underwater analogs of deer and elk and bear. So they're a special and a safe place, a place where we can basically grow our marine resources. So parks are an important tool. Unfortunately, we're behind the curve on establishing parks. Here's what we have for parks. We're about to 5% or so of the oceans that are protected. We're 3 times or so higher than that in terms of the amount of parks we have on land. So we have some catch up and a serious way to do on using this tool to get more parks into our oceans. And you can imagine, as a scientist who likes to think about, well, we don't just want parks, we want smart parks. You can't just take the same sorts of planning tools you use for setting up a national park like Yosemite or Yellowstone and throw it into the ocean. You have to think about how the biology of the ocean is different. Here's one, perhaps obvious, but key element of difference is that ocean animals need more space. This is several thousand data points for how much space, what the home range size is for a bunch of animals from land, green, a bunch of animals from blue, and a bunch of animals from the ocean in blue. By and large, when you standardize by body size, animals in the oceans need more space. That's kind of obvious. If you have a lizard and you have an anchovy, the anchovy needs more space, has a bigger home range than a lizard. Sometimes scientists will sit down and spend a month doing the obvious, and that's what this is, perhaps. Telling you that animals in the oceans need more space, and we need larger parks, consequently, in the oceans. So a very happy thing is happening almost accidentally, and rarely do happy things happen accidentally in the environmental space, but they are, and in a great way in the oceans. I'm showing you here in blue, it sort of gets lost in here, but I'm showing you here in blue the median, the sort of average size for parks in the oceans over time. Something weird happened here. You sort of were cruising along a boutique-sized park, something that's like the size of a golf course, and then suddenly, in the last decade, the size of parks have exploded. The average size of parks have exploded. Now that's a great thing, right? Because we looked here and saw, okay, we need bigger parks in the oceans. And then you look here and you see there's a lot bigger parks going in the oceans. And these are huge, right? This is now happily outdated. There's more like 15 mega parks that are more than 100,000 square kilometers in the oceans. Some of these parks are bigger than California that we're putting into the oceans. And that's a very exciting and happy thing for marine life that uses a lot of space, but it's also a bit of a challenge. The challenge is that imagine what it's like to try to enforce a park that is the size of California in the oceans. How many park rangers do we have here in the Channel National Park? 7. And the size of national park here is sort of more in this space. When we go to a national park that is or a park of any sort, a marine protected area that is the size of California, 7 people can't do it. And I promise you, we're not living in a climate where they're going to hire 700 people to look after this. We need to think about a different kind of solution. For me, it's not boats, and it's not planes, and it's not even drones. But for me, the answer for trying to make these tools more than just paper parks, maybe more than something that just looks good on a map, make sure that they do what they want us to do this service towards helping us stave off extinction in the oceans, is going to space, is using new technologies to help us look down from space to monitor, observe, and protect these parks. So probably a lot of you are aware that there is a revolution. I think everywhere I look, I see revolutions these days, which is exciting. But there is a revolution in terms of technology for Earth observation. There are hundreds of new micro and nanosats, nanosatellites. These are the size of the satellites that have been put into space. They can receive new signals and can even look down and take new pictures of our planet with much higher resolution and much higher frequency than we ever imagined before. And those may be our best friends for looking after these California-sized parks that are way out there in our oceans. Here's an example of what you can do with some of that data. This is the same data stream that we opened our talk with. This plot of sensor data coming from large fishing vessels over the oceans. I'm just animating it here in time. So we're seeing, we're looking at 2012, moving to 2013. We're seeing this animation of fishermen coming and going across our global oceans. That sensor data is being picked up by these nanosatellites, and then we're processing it through machine learning algorithms that help us figure out where and when people are fishing. Now, that is useful for making pretty pictures, but more importantly, it's also useful for doing things like managing really big parks. Here's an example. This box here, this black box, is a California-sized park, truly a California-sized park, just a little bit bigger than our state, that is owned and managed by a nation called Kiribati. It's one of these countries in the Pacific that almost no one's heard of, but they're doing a great thing for the oceans and for global ocean biodiversity because they're setting aside a large section of their ocean space as a park, as a reserve. We looked down at this sensor data for the activity of fishermen that we could see from these satellites 6 months before the park closed, January 1st, 2015. We saw 6 months before the park closed, business was going on as usual. There were a lot of fishermen, a lot of fishing happening inside the park. We looked down 6 months after the park had closed, and we saw that the fishermen had cleared out, that indeed this park seemed to be working, that indeed this park was more than just something that looked good on paper. It looked good for the sea turtles and the marine mammals and the tuna that were out there in this space. We saw, a couple blips of activity inside this park. We shared this data is data we collect in a collaboration with Google and another NGO and a consortium called Global Fishing Watch. We shared information about what we saw using these satellites onto this government Kiribati. They packaged that together into an enforcement portfolio that ended up finding these guys that were still fishing in the park after it closed and finding them $1 million, right? So it's a pretty amazing success story of, again, how technology is helping create problems. We're sort of now getting back to that space of your right? The head fighting the tail thing. Technology is getting us way out into these gigantic parks and helping to increase our influence, but technology is also helping us maybe look after this space more responsibly, more meaningfully than we ever could have hoped for before. Here's just another example of the same tool can be useful for a whole, very big and a very important section of our oceans, the high seas. Everyone knows that our jurisdiction, every nation's jurisdiction, extends out to 200 nautical miles. Beyond that, it's essentially no man's land, right? It's actually, pretty better put, it's every person's land. It's international waters that we all have a stake in. Every tuna out there, I own, Meryl owns, my kid owns, you guys own, right? It's a global heritage. And anyone can go out there and fish. You have a handful of rules, but you can imagine when you have less restriction and international space that can create a scenario that doesn't necessarily go down well for biodiversity. And that's sort of been the history of a lot of these sections of international water. These are not small sections. These are huge sections of our oceans. About 60+% of the ocean is in international waters. So this is a gigantic section that has this unique political regime, like nothing else we see on land. There's no part of California, there's no part of any country that is international in the same way that our oceans are. So the UN realized that, well, this can't keep going on. We have to have a better agreement for all countries getting together to think about a future for biodiversity in this space. So they're now in the process of creating a new treaty for biodiversity in the high seas. Well, that's great. That sounds great. That feels great. But if you're in New York and you're writing a treaty, but you can't see what's going on out there, again, why does that matter? But these new technologies can actually help us, help the United Nations, help the countries that are sort of carrying out whatever treaty it is that settles there in New York, help them actually look down on these gigantic, these remote, but these hyper-biodiverse sections of our oceans and actually make that treaty mean something. So it's pretty exciting. Technology empowering this ambitious technology, empowering some very ambitious policy. Here's another thing you can do with the same kinds of technologies is you can track where seabed mining is happening in our oceans. Anyone who's curious about this? We do a lot of things in my spare time in my lab. One of the things that we do is we run this site called Deep Sea Mining Watch, where we use the same sensor data to plot and show you where deep sea mining is happening in the oceans. It just bugged me that I would give talks like this. People say, I'd never heard of seabed mining. I never knew that was something that was beginning in the oceans. Where is it happening? So we use the same machine learning algorithms to filter not for fishing boats, but to filter for prospectors in the oceans. And then we plot where it's happening. This section of mining claims that I'm showing you, here's a Big Island, Hawaii, the biggest of the Hawaiian Islands. This is a section that is as wide as the continental US that is now in mining claim areas. So you can jump on to the website and look around and get a sense of where in our international backyard prospecting activity is happening for minerals in our oceans. You can do some exciting things with this technology that cross the stories of people, and we've been mostly talking about stories of human interaction in the oceans, but you can cross those in cool ways with other kinds of ocean predators, like sharks. So in my lab, we put GPS sensors that have technology that's pretty similar to the GPS sensors in our phones. We strap them to the fins of sharks so that every time a shark breaks the surface, like Jaws, it kicks off a GPS signal for me. I can sit in my lab in Santa Barbara with a cup of coffee and look at the soap opera of sharks sort of unfold that I've tagged way out, 1,000 miles out in the Central Pacific. We see what parts of the oceans they use. This is in the white dots, or what the sharks are doing. We see what parts of the ocean they use. We see what parts of the ocean they need. We see what space is important to them. Then we grab that same data from fishermen. We see what parts of the ocean they need, what parts they want, what parts they're making profit, collecting dinner. And remember, Meryl and I started as fishermen. We have a lot of respect for that industry as being a really important part of interacting with this wild space, keeping it healthy, getting that health onto our plates for dinner, right? So if you have the story of what sharks need for the oceans, you have the story of what fishermen need for the oceans, you can cross those two stories and do some pretty exciting things. Figure out how do we build a future, zone out a part of the ocean that works for sharks and it works for fishermen. So with this new data, with these new technologies, we're in a much better position to find more sustainable, more secure futures for people and for biodiversity. Another exciting thing, you can't do everything from space. You can't do everything from satellites. We are repurposing some pretty cool technologies that take us to see new parts of the world underwater in ways that we couldn't see before, and get the kind of data to zone out or think or manage the oceans in more thoughtful ways. This is it's called a sound camera. It uses a kind of sonar technology that produces video-like image. You're looking at a parade of manta rays going across the screen here. And I can sit on a reef and I can count how manta rays are using a reef, where they're using corridors between ecosystems and a national marine sanctuary and a wildlife refuge. I can watch that half an hour or an hour at a time. And that gives me these little tiny snippets of what manta rays need. I can put under water Robo-Doug that can sit there and watch the same manta rays for a month or a year at a time and give me a much better picture of how they're using that space. So here's this really cool technology that's taking our insight, creating more of the same kind of big data, but grabbing it from beneath the oceans as well. Okay, so we looked at some technology, we looked at some change, we looked at some risk, and we looked at some technologies that may help us manage this risk. In just a few minutes here at the end, I want to just answer this question. If there seems to be some possibility where we are building or could build towards a future that looks a lot like a 6-mass extinction in the oceans, who cares? And why would we want to avoid that, right? There are a couple very good answers of why if we buy that that is a possibility for future oceans, we don't want that to happen. The first is simply that we're talking about special species, right? You lose the personality of something like a purple square, but you need to remember that folded into those numbers are some of the most amazing animals on our planet. You know, things like the blue whale right out here in the national park. The largest animal, talking about dinosaurs, the largest animal that ever lived on our planet, bigger than any of the dinosaurs. As we said, we've lost those megafauna from that. They're still out there living. The blue whale is that, living right offshore here. This is an animal that is so big, it has a heart the size of a whale, so big that you could actually stick your head and almost swim through its aorta, right? This is not an animal that we want to see missing from a national park. It's not an animal we want to see wrapped around the front of a cargo vessel, right? So we're protecting wildlife, we're protecting biodiversity. That's a part of this important portfolio of life that we are part of on our planet. That's important. But it's not just about saving the whales. It's not just a selfish exercise. This can be an incredibly selfless exercise, trying to avoid a bleak future for wildlife in our oceans. This connects back in some very important ways to our own well-being. This is some work I did as a postdoc at Berkeley, where we tried to figure out, okay, we see lots of parts of our planet, particularly poor parts of our planet, where we see fish crashing. What does that mean for people next to these fish stocks that are crashing? We're actually able to map out in a bunch of different places what that means for human well-being and for human stability. Here's just an example of how you can connect fish to human well-being. You see a decrease in fish. That means you have to fish harder to get the same amount of fish in a poor place, where you don't have the value of the fish going up. You need to bring in new kinds of labor. And in lots of parts of the planet, that means that when this effort increases, you're bringing in alternative labor sources that we don't want to see, like child slavery or slave labor. You probably read some of these stories in the newspaper about unfair labor practices, child labor and slave labor occurring on fisheries. That can happen directly as a result of heading towards these population declines that push us towards this extinction future. So it's not just us, it's not just the whales, it's not just the fish. These things connect back in important ways to our kids. They connect important ways to our plates and to our own health, right? Fish are spectacular. I love being out in a kelp forest, watching rockfish and kelp bass, and could just sit there if I could all day long, watching life in the national park. Probably a lot of you feel the same way, right? But not only are these fish amazing creatures, beautiful creatures, complex creatures, they're also delicious creatures, right? These are packets of wonderfully nutritious nutrients and elements that are really important to human health. This, in a lot of parts of the planet, is incredibly important for staving off, again, if we're asking that question, why? Why not go to that future? This is really important in a lot of parts of the planet, again, a lot of the poor parts of the planet, are preventing us from seeing increases in deficiencies for micronutrients and increases associated with those deficiencies of diseases associated with malnutrition. So you have stuff like vitamin A, zinc, iron that are coded only in the fish. And a lot of parts of the world, it boils down to you're having rice and fish for dinner, or you're only having more rice for dinner. So we sat down in this exercise, which is what this statistic is about. We sat down in an exercise and said, okay, well, what if trajectories of decline and overfishing continue to move forward for the next 50 or 100 years? What if we actually calculated how much the contribution of current fish makes to human health and how much that keeps away these diseases associated with malnutrition? You know, we used public health researchers at Harvard and fish scientists from UBC and our own insight, figured out by putting all these numbers together that if fish declines continue, we're going to see 845 million people on our planet. 845 million people on our planet. They're going to come a lot closer to deficiencies in key micronutrients that keep away diseases like anemia and important diseases associated with mental health development in kids. So it's about whales. It's about human well-being. It's also about our own nutrition in a lot of parts of the planet. So to sort of tie all these pieces together, in the here and now, we see a very positive story. We see less extinction. We see really no footprint for the beginning of a 6-mass extinction in 2017. But there is a but. If we look at vulnerability of species, it would be all too easy for us to build towards a 6-mass extinction in the oceans. It seems that looking at the history of what happened on land identifies in the period of the Industrial Revolution as being a trigger point for extinction on land. If that is so, we want to look attentively and carefully at similar kinds of triggers that may be developing in the oceans. And it does seem, at least on a handful of different axes, that it's not outlandish to think of an industrial revolution forming around us in the oceans in the next 100 or several hundred years. Then there's the head-biting tail thing. It seems that there's a lot of technology. The same technology that's helping us build towards an industrial revolution may help us control, thoughtfully, responsibly control that industrial revolution in a way that doesn't cause the same sort of extinction trigger that it did on land. So here's where Meryl and I grew up, Los Angeles, right? You can imagine for two kids that really like to get outdoors, this was an interesting place to grow up, right? But there are not a lot of biodiversity around you. The ratio of wildlife to concrete, a little bit different than you might expect. And it's easy to forget that this space, Los Angeles, it took us 85 short years, to go from being a pretty wild and a pretty biodiverse desert ecosystem or coastal ecosystem to looking like this. This was a space where grizzly bears were chasing kids that went out to go to outhouses at night about 100 years ago. Right? And now here we are, 85 years later. Now, for a kid or a set of kids like Meryl and I, growing up in this space, if we wanted to get into the wilderness, all we had to do was get on this freeway, jump over here, run down to the coast, put on a mask, get underwater, and then suddenly we were like in a time machine, back in the wild, in some of the wildest places on the planet, just because we got underwater. You're sort of in sight of downtown Los Angeles, almost literally, and you'd be sharing company with 200-pound giant sea bass. You could be sharing space, for better or worse, with 2,000-pound great white sharks. At the right time of year, you could have 20,000, 40,000-pound gray whales coming by, breathing right next to you. Right? So you were in it. You were in this wild space. And thinking about that sharp contrast, to me, I think helps think about the imperative, the urgency, and the potential for change that now we may be looking at in the oceans. I'm not suggesting that in 85 years we're going to go from what the oceans in our national park and around our national park look like now to something that looks like this. But I am suggesting that there's a lot of data that shows that we may be heading towards a different place in our oceans. If we are heading towards that different place, that may matter for extinction and biodiversity in our oceans. And if that matters for and affects extinction and biodiversity, that may affect our own well-being. So let me leave it there and field any questions that you guys have.
Thank you. I'm very concerned about the edible fish that we're going to have in the future from all the plastic that's in the ocean, as far as down as the deep of the Mariana Trenches and in the very smallest vertebrates. How do you feel about that?
Yeah, that's a really great one to point out in terms of change and in terms of human presence and footprint in the oceans. 5 trillion, with a T, trillion pieces of plastic as our lower bound estimate of what's in the ocean right now, right? And that's no good. That's a major source of pollution. And you're right. it's just striking to see when we think about the wildness of the oceans. We go to some of the most remote parts of the oceans, to Antarctica, to the Marianas Trench, and you find plastic trash sitting there, right? It's working our way, as you say, into our food webs. The unfortunate thing about plastics is that it doesn't really biodegrade the same way that we think of like a paper bag biodegrading. It just basically breaks down into tinier and tinier particles, which makes it more of an insidious problem. It then enters the food webs through ingestion to plankton, and then can route itself up these food webs. We're seeing plastic in the stomachs, at least, of fish that end up in our fish market. So it's a major source of concern. As a biologist, we're really concerned about what it means for ocean food webs. And to be honest, it is just begun registering like this, holy cow, we have this new problem that is emerging big time in the oceans. What does it mean for wildlife? What does it mean for us as people that eat this wildlife, that use this wildlife? There's a lot of uncertainty about what it means to have this plastic coming into our own food webs and our own food chains by having these fish in our markets. And we're sort of beginning to figure out whether that is actually routing pollutants into fish. And there's a lot of uncertainty on the biology side. Does having all of this plastic, which is certainly, I can tell you one thing, is that there's uncertainty around the science, but we're not going to discover that plastic is great for the oceans. So while there remains some uncertainty, what we're trying to figure out is how bad is it? Is it actually causing there to be less fish? Is it causing a lot of the bottom of these food chains to be less productive than they could be because they're eating this junk? There are not great answers for you yet, but there are a lot of scientists that are working, including those at UC Santa Barbara, that are working hard on trying to come up with better answers than I can give you today about that question. It is clearly something that we want to pay attention to and work on remediating. And the interesting thing, and the happy thing, is that one at least is one that we, for better or worse, are linked to, right? So, you may not be able to go home and create a new marine park. You could write your congressperson when the time comes, or when you see a conversation like that happening, and get involved. But you can every day, every meal, every time you're out having lunch at a restaurant, you can think about whether you want to get more of this single-use plastic that's with you for 30 seconds in your life, and in the oceans for 500 years. But you can control some of that flow. So that's a great one to bring up.
Great lecture. Thank you so much. I'm hearing some conversations more and more about the impact of the Fukushima
right.
Effect on the sea life. Can you talk about how bad it really is, and should we not be eating seafood right now?
So that's an interesting one. The Fukushima, the power plant, right, that was hit by the tsunami and then spilled all the radioactivity into the Pacific Ocean. That is definitely a worrisome one. It was a very worrisome one for us because we saw this plume of radioactivity slowly but surely marching across the oceans. We were able, and it was actually, in some ways, a perverse kind of chemical marker that was very good for oceanographers. For the first time they could study currents by having labeled this thing as it spirals around and study the movement of these water masses across the Pacific. Now, the good news about the radioactivity is that it's in such low levels in any of the oceans that we would be eating from and interacting with that it's not something to be concerned about. So you can measure that radioactivity in certain fish stocks, including tuna, that swim through these plumes. And again, it was a perverse marker. We could find out when a fish hit that plume and know something more about its migration routes. But it's in such low densities that it's not at all damaging to human health. When these conversations about mercury and mercury concentrating in tuna, that's a real thing. That's something to be concerned about. But you don't need to, it's always good. And we try to be responsible at saying, there are things to really get concerned about, and there are things that we don't know about. Plastics are in that category, for me at least. Radioactivity is at least associated with Fukushima spill, is in the category that scientists are pretty certain that you don't need to worry about it in terms of seafood consumption. What's that? No Godzilla. No, not that we're aware of yet. Now, it has caused some serious local impacts around Fukushima. I think that they've shut down the fisheries the coastal fisheries right near the power plants, but that's not fish that will end up on your dinner plate. So, and in fact, it's not ending up even on Japan's dinner.
Question involves the deep sea mining, and what areas is it prevalent, and who regulates it? And I know that if you go out, I think 9 miles, it's international waters. Or could you kind of go into that a little bit?
Yeah. So 200 nautical miles is the border of every country. So the U.S. has a swath around all parts, even our islands around Hawaii. We have this buffer of 200 nautical miles, so we get to say what happens in those 200 nautical miles. Then beyond that are international waters. The gigantic mining claim field in the Central Pacific near Hawaii that we looked at, that is all in international waters. So again, we have this collective ownership to all of the manganese and the gold and the copper that's coming out of that space. It's been an interesting political experiment because we haven't mined before in the oceans, and so we had to figure out, we had to figure out what we were going to do to manage that. What the United Nations did was it created a body called the International Seabed Authority that's in charge of saying, okay, we're going to draw out these mining claim areas, we're going to decide who gets them, who doesn't get them. We're going to try, which is a good thing, and then they're trying to make sure that it doesn't all go to rich countries, that they distribute that wealth, because we all own it, right? It goes to rich countries and poor countries. And they're trying to figure out, if we put a claim area in here, if we start mining it, how do we offset the biological damage of that? There are ways they could be doing that more sustainably. Part of the reason, or more aggressively and more responsibly, part of the reason we started tracking this prospecting activity was to make people a little bit more aware of it, asking more questions just like you're asking, so that we have a little bit more oomph behind us as biologists. We sit down at the table with the International Seabed Authority and try to write out the rules for how this is going to happen in the sea in a way that works as best as we possibly can for biodiversity. And to be clear, what we're doing right now is we are prospecting in the oceans. So this activity that you see on the website is prospecting boats going out to these claims they've been assigned and grabbing big sections of the ocean to see where they want to mine commercially. The next phase is going to commercial large-scale mining on these zones. That may happen next year. It may happen in the next 5 years. Well, actually, it'll almost certainly happen this year or next year for a couple projects, at least one project. And then if that goes full scale, it'll probably be a handful of years. We're literally writing the rules for how that happened. And our lab is actually has had the privilege of being truly at the table, having some conversation with some of the leadership at the International Seabed Authority about how we can make this work better for that really important section of the oceans. So it's exciting. It's new. It's exciting in the way that you just think about the opportunity. If you could go back and say, okay, I don't necessarily want to stop mining because maybe I need iron for building my car. I think we do, right? But what if I could go back and before mining it ever started, I said, okay, I know where all the good resources and the good stuff is I want to mine. I also know where all the good forests and biodiversity are. I know where the sensitive species and the sensitive habits are. I'm going to zone this out. If we could go back in time and redo the whole mining experiment, we could do it so much smarter, with a higher biological, ecological IQ in a way that was even more efficient. That's the experiment we're now running in the ocean, which makes it a proactive and exciting thing. Countries and corporations. In some cases, it's a country like Russia. In some cases, it's a corporation like Tonga hires a corporation from Canada that's out there building these machines and doing the sampling.
I appreciate all the times you said exciting. I'm right here.
Okay.
Thank you. I needed that. But there's a lot of people right now who are concerned about what's happening politically and are concerned in ways that are causing them to feel like, okay, I want to be active. I want to be an activist and make some kind of a difference. Given that it looks like there may be some issues related to regulations and protections in the future. What would you suggest for people to take active role in having a voice currently?
It's a great question. Obviously, a very timely question right now. It's not a great time to be a scientist or not a great time to be an advocate for the oceans, just in our own country, because there's less leadership than there used to be on some of these important issues. We see that here, or we feel that here in the national park. We all care about this. We see conversations about the budget, about how we're going to be responsible stewards for this really special place being impacted. NOAA, which does similar kind of work in some of the same space, huge budget cuts being proposed. Those are our custodians that keep these amazing parks, keep Merrill out there on the water, keep his colleagues out there studying this space, looking after this space. The first thing I would say is, watch how these budget conversations go down for places like the national park and have very active conversations with your representatives in DC about how you feel about this. Now, most people in California are kind of already on the same page, but it cannot hurt to make sure that they know that you care about your national parks and you don't want to see any of these things roll back. Some of these gigantic another just quick example. Some of these gigantic marine protected areas, historically oceans were not a very bipartisan thing. That was, to use exciting one more time, it was an exciting thing. I work out and do research on these sharks in a section that George W. Bush protected. And then Obama came in and protected that exact same space. So it was really special that, we went through a few periods where everybody was on board about looking after the oceans. We're now in a different space. In DC, we're talking actually about undoing some of those ocean monuments. So there's one that, letters and voices and calls could help a lot with. So. Yeah, there are there are a half dozen. Well, these are most of the folks that keep me in business. There are a couple that we work, which I think a lot of. So in the ocean space, I mean, first of all, I would say, for your own national park, right? If we're talking about taking money away from one pool, there are the Friends of the Foundation of the National Park here that is a alternative pool to say, well, we had this subtraction here. We want to keep all of these services running. I think that's one real important place in your own backyard for a place that we're here because we care about. We can think and we can act and we can have that conversation. So that's that is a local solution. At the global level, for marine parks and sanctuaries, the Pew Foundation is a group that we work a lot with that does really good work getting scientists in front of policymakers and getting science in front of policymakers and being good about safeguarding some of these parks and oceans. So I would first think about, what can you do to look after people here if it was going to be sort of some very serious tight times for the next 40 years.
I just wanted to mention that Congress is on break right now, so all the representatives are in their home districts until the 23rd. This is a perfect time to contact your local representatives.
A very good point.
Hi, Dr. McCauley. On your data, when you were showing the great picture of the fishing globally, I noticed that China, our most populous country, the waters off that were not indicated as fished. Right. What is the reason for that?
Right. There are some blind spots in that data, and China is one of those blind spots. The taking data from the sensors requires compliance. It requires that you actually use them properly and you have them turned on. So we get a little bit of some darkness around some of the local fishing fleets in China. We see China, despite the fact that there are some compliance issues with the sensor with China, we still see them in these international waters in the high seas as being one of the most prevalent across the global ocean. So they're not just fishing on China, they're fishing all across the global oceans. We still see, despite the fact that there may be some issues with them playing by the rules, that we still see more Chinese, the top three big ones include China out there in their national waters. But that's an important point, that one of the things with technology is often very closely empowered by policy. So one of the first things we did with this technology, we figured out, okay, we can track fishing boats. We can use it to look after protected areas, but we need then to make sure that people in the Coast Guard, people in the international, every country's own version of the Coast Guard is making sure that they're following international laws that say you need to be carrying these sensors. These sensors are actually safety sensors. We sort of back-ended into this data. So the sensors are to make sure that like a ferry ship doesn't crash into a mining ship out there. So you're transmitting your location all the time so you don't run into one another. We just took that same data and processed it through these algorithms to help us figure out who were fishing and who's shipping and doing other things and pulled out this data. But it requires that you're using your safety sensor properly, which not every country is doing.
More question.
Thanks, Dr. McCauley. Actually, a really nice person told me not too long ago that how interconnected we are with the oceans, and it's something like 1 out of 3 breaths we take are a result of the oceans. And I think, tonight your talk was wonderful, but we're sort of preaching to the choir How do you get the word out of how important the oceans are to people in Idaho and to people in, because it's a global, we're all connected and we all survive.
Right.
But people are, and I'm as ignorant on many things as the next person, but we go about our business, and I don't think most people realize how interconnected we are and how serious some of these issues are.
Right. That's a super question. I mean, it's exciting stuff. It's also super serious stuff. We're literally talking about the future health for 845 less, well-off kids in the planet, right? And so, these are really important conversations to have. How do we get this out? I mean, I'm here because I think it's important. You're here because it's important. So sort of take what you're learning here and talk to your neighbors. The national park here is here for the very same mission every day, every weekend, trucking people back and forth between to a pretty cool part of the ocean to tell its own story and inspire and get people to care. I mean, be that person that somewhere in fourth grade got me excited about the ocean. Be that person for your neighbor or your own kids or whatever. And it is a very global issue. I mean, you're absolutely right. You can do the math different ways about oxygen. A average number comes out to be 50%. 50% of the oxygen that we breathe comes from the planet. So I was talking in Utah about oceans. My Uber driver said, "You're going to Utah to talk about the oceans?" And I said, "You can't believe how important that conversation is going to be." And so we started by talking about that fact, that every other breath that we're taking in Utah, every other breath you take in Nebraska, you take in Uzbekistan, comes from the ocean. So our fate is intimately intertwined with what this future becomes that we're talking about here now. And you guys are here because you understand that, but we all have a responsibility to sort of carry that inspiration, carry that science, carry that sort of obligation forward to all the people in our own life. There's some creative ways. Technology is helping us get it out more, but sometimes just simply grabbing your kids and taking them down to the beach or taking them out to the national parks and getting them blown away by something as cool as a blue whale plants that seed and will grow. So you guys all have homework from Professor McCauley.